A warm welcome to you here at THEKI, your podcast for consciousness, health, and happiness. My name is Sandra, and today we're talking about something that has fascinated me for a very long time, for many, many years. Memories from other times have kept resurfacing about it, and I keep exploring it, combining it with the latest scientific explanations. And now, yes, I've reached a point where I feel like everything is coming together. And at least an important part of this very, very complex topic can now be shared with you via podcast. It's about the ancient mysteries, reloaded. So we're not talking about some dusty old concept, but about what is eternal, what is always valid. As humanity, we are currently standing at a threshold, both individually and collectively, where if we can once again understand and integrate certain mysteries, we can actually see them as keys to a new world. Because hidden within them are universal codes that can lead us to freedom on all levels. So this podcast is really different from all my previous ones simply because it addresses topics that were known as the mysteries in ancient times. So very special topics, and also on my part, very specific points that I have connected there. Yes, why should this information be important today? Quite simply, if we understand the symbolism and the deeper meaning of this order of 12, then we also understand where we might still be living in a mental prison, that is, the matrix from which we all in some way want, may, or can escape. And the key is the number 13 to break open this old prison. So, on the one hand, it's a journey through cultures and ancient mysteries that we're embarking on here. On the other hand, it's also about a very clear and direct application of this knowledge in our lives in today's so-called modern world. By reintegrating what was split off, we make it possible to break through ancient boundaries and truly expand back into our true being. And yes, so I won't go into detail in this podcast about who cut us off, who took away the ancient knowledge from us. There are plenty of explanations for this, but they always just keep us stuck in a cycle, trapped in powerlessness, because ultimately, yes, there are those who did it or co-created it, but there are also those who allowed it to happen to them, who did not stand up for the truth and preservation of their values and this so important knowledge. And in times when the vibration drops, as was the case in the last age, it is also relatively normal for high vibrational knowledge to be lost. That's also a completely natural part of it. Yes, there doesn't always have to be villains involved, not just because it was suppressed, but above all because the general vibration of people drops so much that they forget, or rather that the importance of these things is no longer so clear to them, and they don't preserve the old knowledge, partly because they can no longer really understand it. And now in this present time and vibration, this ancient knowledge is becoming accessible again. Little by little, the veils are lifting and revealing once again the profound knowledge that is so valuable to us on our path to physical, mental, and also spiritual freedom. Because here too, I see everywhere that there are so many boundaries among people and so much misdirection. It's truly about freedom on all levels of our being. The ancient traditions, yes, teach us the same profound truths again and again through a variety of paths. No matter whether we draw on astrological knowledge, numerological knowledge, energetic knowledge, even psychological knowledge, or consider cosmic knowledge, it always leads to the same core. And now I would like to take you along on this journey so that we can get an overview together and also gladly dive deeper. So the numbers 12 and 13, these numbers contain a universal code, a very important transition. And as I said, this is by no means about some old dusty knowledge, even if I later talk about tarot and all sorts of things. It often just seems that way because we only know old expressions for it, or also legends, stories, books, writings from ancient times, which are formulated in this old language. And then it all seems so obsolete or so strange to us, so complicated. But because of the way things were expressed back then, we somehow can't really take it seriously. But in the ancient mysteries, universal codes are hidden that are now becoming understandable and accessible again. And that's why I would like to dust it all off and put it into words that can be understood today. Because I see it this way. It is our task in today's times. Yes, not just a task, but also a great gift to dust off this knowledge, to understand it, and to put it into contemporary words, so that it can once again be adapted to current world issues, and so that we can once again recognize the opportunities they offer us. And when we recognize these opportunities, then logically we will also walk these paths again and enter into true freedom on all levels. In the coming years, starting from 2026, this freedom will be the overarching theme of the world, and the mysteries reloaded are the key. Let's get started. The concept of 12 and 13 numbers as a universal language. So if we understand how the meaning of 12 is completed order and the meaning of explosive force and reordering, how the 13 works in our lives and can once again be consciously applied, then we are a huge step further. And for thousands of years, cultures have used numbers, not just for counting, but to express meaning as symbolic systems of order to make the invisible practically tangible again. So numbers are vibration. And one of the most striking is the number 12. Standing right at its threshold is the 13. The 13 is feared, revered, suppressed. I'll get to that in a moment. Together, 12 and 13 tell a story of completion, that's 12, and transformation, that's 13. Completely independent of time, place, cultural background, or even religion, we find this everywhere. And in the following, I'll simply show you a few examples of how 12 and 13 interact. Stay curious. But before that, I want to briefly explain to you that all these examples are based on one thing. 12 is perfect order. 12 always shows us a self-contained system, something that is complete, that is finished, that has become perfect, also a completed cycle. But life always means development. That's why it can't just stay at 12. You can imagine 12 like a circle. But if you always just move within this circle, then you're in an endless loop without any development. And that's like being trapped inside it. Like a prison. That means 12 isn't bad. It's wonderful, truly wonderful for describing a perfect order. But it's not alive if we stay within it. It's always about moving beyond this order, developing ourselves out of it again until we find ourselves in a new 12. And relating this to our lives today, this means that whenever we encounter a closed circle formed by 12, we should use the explosive force of 13 to move ourselves forward. Even social systems themselves lock us in this way. It's up to us to understand and change things through the 13. And it's not just that 12 is sold to us as the perfect ending. It's even the case that 13 has been so demonized that we don't want to have anything to do with it. 13, we're afraid of it. You might know that 13 is now considered an unlucky number in many cultures, especially in our Western cultures. It goes so far that in high-rise buildings, there's often no 13th floor, or in airplanes, no 13th row, and so on. So it's become deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness that 13 is bad, that we don't want it. We're afraid of 13. But what if 13 is exactly the key we've been searching for all this time? What if we're supposed to move beyond 12, but someone wants to keep us stuck at 12? What if we're supposed to overcome our fear of 13 in order to truly move forward? Now let's get to the promised examples. So the number 12. As a number of cosmic order, we have, for example, Across cultures, 12 is considered the number of wholeness. It always stands for a completed cycle, for a complete system. In this, the number 3 represents Chao, spirit, heaven, and consciousness, while the number 4 stands for matter, earth, and the 4 elements. And this 3 times 4 makes 12, which is the connection between heaven and earth. So 12 creates order and brings all complexity down to an experienceable level. The number 12, in the cosmos and in astrology, that's our next example. In astrology, the number 12 appears as a complete map of experience. For example, there are 12 zodiac signs as archetypal stages of consciousness development. There are 12 houses, 12 months, 12 full moons that are highlighted here. I'll get to the point later that in some cases there are actually 13. There are 12 hours of the day and 12 hours of the night in ancient timekeeping systems. This 12th house is especially significant. It stands for dissolution, withdrawal, surrender, and spiritual preparation. It is the end of the circle, but not yet the new beginning. The new beginning would be the 13th. In all kinds of religions and also in mythology, we find the number 12, always where divine order or sacred structure is to be described. In Christianity, there are the 12 apostles, the 12 tribes of Israel. In Judaism, too, the 12 tribes of Jacob, the 12 gemstones in the breastplate of the high priest. In Islam, specifically in Shia Islam, there are 12 imams. In ancient Greece, there were 12 Olympian gods and the 12 labors of Heracles. In Norse mythology, there are 12 principal gods in Asgard. In all these traditions, the number 12 marks this complete divine system, this order that holds the world together, that is complete in itself. Even in psychology, we can find the number 12. Carl Gustav Jung saw 12 as a symbol of becoming whole, so once again, the circle. In spiritual visions at that time, according to him, mandalas, circles, and these divisions into 12 would appear when the self strives for integration. So we strive for the 12 in order to finally be in perfection, to be whole within ourselves. The 12 is also fitting in the tarot. There, card 12, the Hanged Man, stands for exactly this moment, for this pause, for the change in perspective, for the voluntary surrender to a higher meaning that arises from the 12, because it cannot simply end there. The 12 is not activity, but 12 is maturity, completion. So, and now we come to 13. 13 is beyond the old order. So, where 12 closes the circle, 13 breaks it open. Mathematically, it's simple. 13 is 12 plus 1, but symbolically that's radical because the 1 is something entirely new. This one does not stand for a return to order, but for a leap. So 13 does not expand on the old, but is a transformation to a new level. The previous order is left behind or even shattered. Sometimes the transition is gentle, and sometimes it has this explosive force in favor of a new level that is then reached. In the tarot, 13 is death. This is also always something that is presented to us in a way that makes us feel we have to be afraid. Many people find it really terrible when they draw this card. But it's actually a beautiful card because with 13, the previous order is broken up. In favor of a new possibility and level, in favor of a vitality that is only possible when the old, which is now closed in on itself, dies. So dies in the sense of death, transformation. In the tarot, the 13 does not signify the end of life, but rather the end of a form. What dies is that which is no longer genuine, what is now being overcome. The message of the 13 is, you cannot become who you are without letting go of who you were. Yes, and the 13, why was it so feared? The 13 breaks up systems. That's exactly why it was demonized in many patriarchal cultures. Friday the 13th, as an unlucky day, and so on. I've already mentioned it, the airplane rows that high-rise building floors that are missing, as well as other attributions of misfortune. Pure superstition was projected onto it. But this fear, and this is important because it's about today and where we are being held captive, this fear is artificially created. It is not archetypal. Archetypically, the 13 is simply something truly wonderful that helps us move forward. And in older nature-based traditions, the 13 was sacred. Let's take, for example, the 13 and the feminine. That is very interesting. The 13 is closely connected to the moon, the body, and the cyclical wisdom of life. There are 13 lunar cycles per year, not 12. These are also the rhythms of menstruation and fertility. In many ancient cultures, it was the number of the great goddess. For example, in indigenous traditions like the Hopi or Cherokee, the 13 clan mothers, the number 13 stands for the cycle of birth and death, for shedding, initiation, yes, also for that uncontrollable wild force. As long as you stay within the circle, you may be trapped, but everything is controllable. You know exactly what's there. And if you leave this circle, you need to bring a bit of a sense of adventure with you. With the suppression of the feminine, the number 13 was also suppressed. That way, everything could be kept within this 12, within this orderly, controllable framework, you see? Maybe you remember that I already talked about this in detail in my 2 podcasts about darkness, how the feminine was suppressed and how we were made to fear the dark, that darkness was equated with evil. And the number 13 shows this even more. 13 is the breakthrough that many of us are waiting for, internally, but also collectively and globally. Let's take another look at the 12 months and 13 moons. Something doesn't add up there, does it? In our Gregorian calendar, 12-month structure the year. That's again this very clear, stable framework of order. But naturally, there are 13 lunar cycles per solar year if you count the moon from new moon to new moon. So the 12-month structure is something that developed culturally, and that is practical, but from an astronomical perspective, it's not exact. The 13th moon doesn't quite fit neatly into this clear, stable framework of order. That's why it was simply removed and solutions were found. But many indigenous cultures still orient themselves by these 13 moons even today, as it allows them to live much more easily in harmony with nature, the cosmos, and the cycles. Just as it was with the very ancient cultures, such as the Maya, the pre-dynastic Egyptians, or the Celts. Each lunar phase was seen as a gateway or initiation full of possibilities. Back then, the year was usually divided into 12 complete cycles. And then there was an additional threshold month with the 12 representing order, structure, and clearly defined periods. And the 13 stood for transformation, transition, and the time between worlds. So we could also say that the 12 symbolizes social order, and the 13 reveals the natural truth behind it. Life does not only follow structure, there is also initiation, transformation, and cyclical thresholds that cannot be forced into rigid systems. Let's continue with more examples. An incredibly important and so far almost unknown factor is the Christ oil, which I have been working with for quite some time and about which I will also tell you more. But not here and today. However, there is an incredible amount of important knowledge that is now resurfacing. The Christ oil promotes within us the process of enlightenment and Christ consciousness. It is one of the mysteries that are now resurfacing. Hardly known, but very remarkable. The Christ oil, which forms within us every 29.5 days, exactly in sync with the moon, and undergoes certain processes in our system, during which it is either destroyed by an unconscious way of living or elevates the entire system, body, soul, and spirit, to a completely new level energetically. It energizes and also rejuvenates. And there are very meaningful exercises and ways of living, especially for those few days each month that make it possible to preserve the oil, let it rise, and then through this process, energize the entire body. Dormant brain cells awaken. So we gain much greater potential, activated. Our blood is purified and much more. These are truly very powerful processes. And let me tell you, after 12 cycles, that is 12 months, the results of these processes become really visible and tangible. Here we have the number 13 again, which is beyond 12. There are also a few examples of this in nature, blossoms and fractals. So even in the plant world, these structures based on 12 often appear as a stable order, for example, in leaves and petals. And the number 13 appears when growth continues. Like a spiral that moves up to the next level. Examples include sunflowers, pine cones, roses, but also spirals that represent the Fibonacci sequence, 13, 21, 34. So even in nature, 13 is the first leap beyond the previously closed form. Trees also follow a 12-phase annual rhythm: bud, leaf, fruit, withdrawal. But there is a 13th, a phase that is often overlooked. And that is the quiet moment after letting go before something new arises. This is not a visible state, but rather this transitional state, which is energetically extremely important. And that's always the case, which is why I always mention it in connection with the feminine and also with darkness. Because, in our world, we are so shaped by the principle of activity and always look for it that we only see these to really name and understand principles, but these quiet moments in the dark, in the feminine, in which seemingly nothing happens, but in which so much actually happens. That is the 13. And that is so important. The 13 is the invisible between death and new beginning. Yes, and even in the examples of cycles, tides, and windows of chaos, I have found this pattern. Tides follow a very stable rhythm, that is, an order. But there is a chaos window approximately every 12 to 13 cycles. We can also see this, for example, in the 12,000-year cycle, at the end of which there is always a major transition, the 13th. So a new era. I have written about this in detail in my book Involution. Often associated with chaos and cataclysms, with floods, altered coastlines, renewed ecosystems, and so on. The 13 appears as a destroyer, but it is actually more of a cleansing and creative disruption in favor of a higher reordering. Nature inherently favors the 12 as a fundamental structure, but it truly needs the 13 to stay alive and thrive. The circle is perfect, but dead. And the spiral, that one is imperfect, but alive, open. The spiral allows for growth without breaking. You don't have to break and damage the circle. If you are already in a spiral, you can complete the circle and quite naturally continue to rise. Yes, and we also find this principle in metamorphosis from caterpillar to butterfly. And it's often quoted, especially when it comes to our spiritual development. It's often said that this is our human metamorphosis. But what really happens inside the cocoon? The caterpillar's body completely gives itself up. It doesn't simply transform, but is mostly liquefied. The cells completely lose their old function and meaning. And so-called imaginal cells, imaginal meaning long overlooked, take over. The caterpillar does not continue to develop. It gives itself up and becomes something new. The cocoon is not a developmental stage in that sense, but rather a threshold space. And the number 13 represents this phase, you see, the loss of identity, the transition. the beginning of something completely new, even if we can't name it yet, even if the butterfly hasn't appeared yet. So metamorphosis always means, and especially in this case, though we can apply it everywhere, the death of the form, but not of the essence. And now take a look. We have a 12th-grade school system, which is very widespread. I deliberately entered the multiplication sign. And that's the case in many countries, especially, of course, in Western countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the USA, the UK, France, Japan, Finland, and so on. We have installed this 12th-grade system as the preferred system. And with that, a circle is being closed. The human, the student, was educated for 12 years. I'll put that in quotation marks regarding our current school system. But old principles are applied there, stating that for humans it should also be 12 years. This education and preparation for one's life. And 13 is then the transition into their own independent choice of how things should proceed. But of course, they can only choose correctly if they haven't been completely misformed in those 12 years, shaped away from their own nature. The question isn't whether a person is shaped in 12 years, but how? We live in a culture that practically leads through the 12, but catches no one when the 13 begins. Because the 13, it is so important. It is the disorientation, the emptiness, the chaos, the lack of identity from which something new emerges. But what does our system do? After 12 years of school, give or take, it's usually already planned how things will continue, because that's just how it has to be. The 13 is postponed, hidden, suppressed, and then often shows up later in crises of meaning, like depression, menopausal symptoms, midlife crisis, whatever. Eventually, it takes back what was missed there. In comparison with indigenous cultures, there this 13 is lived. It is seen as an initiation and is very consciously accompanied, celebrated, and supported. So if someone enters this emptiness and meaninglessness and disorientation, then it's professionally accompanied. And that person is supported in their intrinsic motivation. And what about our culture when someone doesn't know what they want or falls into the void and can't do anything with themselves? That is pathologized, it seems sick. Something is wrong with him or with her. There are the 12 chakras, dear ones. The expansion of consciousness. Our next example. In the classical yoga or tantra system, there are the 7 main chakras along the spine. They stand for physical, emotional, and mental energy. And the concept of the 12 chakras is a very conscious expansion of this system to finer levels, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. I have written about this in detail in my second book, Involution, and also in my third book, Soul Power. And we've been doing the activation of the 12 chakras for several years now in my seminars, because I've realized that it's now possible to go far beyond the 7 chakras. The 12 chakras, they form a complete integration cycle, similar to the 12 strands of DNA, we'll get to that too, or the 12 hours of the night in the Egyptian Amduat, I'll get to that as well. The 12 chakras form a compass, like an inner journey of initiation. Each chakra corresponds to a step on the path from material existence to expanded consciousness. And the 13th level, it practically integrates everything. Into your feelings, into your cosmos, but also into your everyday life. It's simply the integration in the heart and thus also in everyday life. 13 is not a 13th chakra in the classical sense, but the lived implementation. It's about moving into a unified chakra now, the heart space, in which all the qualities of the activated chakras unite and are always accessible to the person. So the 13th level shows here how to integrate the activation of all chakras into life, into actions, relationships, and creativity, and thus live heart-based. In the heart, all the potentials and properties of all chakras meet. I'm sure you've thought of it yourself, the classic zodiac, 12 signs of the zodiac. The zodiac is based on the sun's path, the ecliptic, which is divided into 12 segments of 30 degrees each. Each segment then corresponds to a constellation, so Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so on until Pisces. Historically, this division was made because 12 fit well with the months, lunar cycles, and seasons, which were bent to fit however one wanted. The number 12 has a clear order, namely completeness, structure, a finished system. As always, as we've already heard, in fact, however, the sun crosses a 13th constellation on its path. Imagine that, the hidden 13th star. It's called Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. And Ophiuchus lies between the constellations of Scorpio and Sagittarius. So astronomically speaking, Ophiuchus is real, but classical astrologers haven't included it as an official sign. It doesn't fit into the order of 12. And our zodiac also ignores the 13th moon or the 13th sign in order to stabilize the 12-fold dynamic. Order is also preferred here over natural variability or vitality. 13 is not allowed to be, you see? And why it might make sense to also take the 13th into account. If you look at the rhythm of the sun, moon, and earth, of course, then the number 13 fits perfectly into the archetypal structure of transformation, because 12 stands for structure, order, and the familiar once again, and 13 marks the breakthrough, the new consciousness. In astrological terms, Ophiuchus would symbolize themes of healing, transformation, and wisdom from crises. Exactly that quality of 13 that we've already seen in all the other topics. The question is, do we need a new calendar based on the 13 moons again? Is that the eternal divine order, and does this 13th zodiac sign help us make new consciousness livable again? I'll leave that open for now. Yes, and then I already mentioned the 13 clan mothers from indigenous traditions like Cherokee, Hopi, and Iroquois, maybe others too. They're also sometimes called the 13 grandmothers, and they also fit perfectly into this 12-13 pattern. They're practically the human archetypal equivalent of the 13th level of initiation. They're essentially 13 wise women who act as keepers of knowledge, tradition, and spiritual order. Each clan mother represents an archetypal principle where the 13th clan mother represents the power of integration and transformation, the force that goes beyond the ordered structure. Perfect, right? And then I also briefly mentioned that religions show us these archetypes too. The 12 apostles gathered around Jesus. And we can recognize archetypes in the apostles. And in Jesus, the 13 is visible, the new divine order, that which completely shattered the previous framework, the further development, transformation of what came before, the resurrection of the Christ consciousness, which, on the one hand, unites everything within itself, the 12, and yet it is beyond that. And interestingly, the 12 and 13 also appear in the ancient Egyptian worldview. Underworld, the sun's path, and the road to immortality. So in ancient Egyptian culture, numbers weren't abstract but existential. They described the processes of life, of dying, and of rebirth. And especially the 12 and 13 played a very central role. There were, for example, these 12 hours of the night, which represent an order in the realm of the underworld. You can read about that in the ancient Egyptian book of the afterlife, specifically in the Amduat. That means that which is in the underworld. The night was divided into 12 hours, through which the sun, in the form of the god Ra, practically travels every night. And these 12 hours are very clearly structured and represent a complete passage through the various stages, through the realm of death, in which there are then trials, gates, and tasks. Each hour represents a stage of transformation, but it is not yet salvation. Ra passes through these 12 hours every night so that the world can be renewed in the morning. That means 13 is the rebirth with the morning sun as something completely new emerges. After the 12th hour, in the moment of deepest darkness, the breakthrough occurs. Ra is born anew. And this phase, it's not a 13th hour, but symbolically it's clearly the 13. In several afterlife texts, the underworld is described as a sequence of gates, usually 12 in number, and each gate demands knowledge and a certain inner maturity. But only after this last gate is the soul not just finished, but ready. Ready for what? For the 13. The actual initiation happens beyond the gates, where no structure helps anymore, only truth. And other ancient Egyptian myths, like that of Osiris, also follow this sequence. Quite exciting to go deeper into that. So 13 was also a number of initiation in ancient Egyptian thought. The afterlife was not a place, but a state of consciousness that could only be reached through initiation. 12 was practically preparation, testing, cosmic order. And 13 was insight, merging with the sun's path and thereby deification. Many later spiritual systems have also taken up exactly this structure again. There are always these 12 stages or 12 tests. And then the breakthrough, the light after the night. Ancient Egyptian culture is, by the way, among the oldest verifiable sources in which this 12-13 dynamic is fully developed as an initiation path. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, we can summarize 12 is the path through the night, and 13 is the recognition of one's own divine light. Yes, then you might remember that I've already done an extensive podcast on the 12 or 13 dimensions. Classical physics defines 4 dimensions. String theory, then 10, M theory, 11 dimensions. And Burkhard Heim, the famous quantum physicist, could define and explain 12 dimensions. The 13th dimension is the spiritual composition. So again, the intangible, the beyond, the divine source. In metaphysical concepts and spiritual or esoteric teachings, 13 dimensions are usually described as levels of consciousness or existence. But they have less to do with space and time in the physical sense, but rather with states of consciousness, soul levels, and the multidimensional self. The spiritual 13-dimension model describes, different levels of consciousness, as do all models of existence and energy that one goes through or can experience in the developmental process, from dense matter to the source of all being. And these dimensions are often described as an ascension journey or as a return to unity, so from separation back to the source 13D. Let's come to DNA, the biological order. DNA is not just a biological storage medium, as it's often presented to us, but we can truly say a highly structured, fascinating ordering principle of life. If we look at it symbolically and in the light of these ancient wisdom traditions, then there appears, I think, quite an amazing parallel to this 12-13 dynamic of order and transformation. 12 is considered a complete genetic order. DNA. DNA is basically a system of relatively clear rules, repetitions, and cycles. It ensures that life remains stable, remains reliable, and also remains reproducible. We have 12 DNA strands that need to be awakened. In most people, only 2 or 3 strands are active, but in the ascension process and also specifically through activations that we can do with THEKI, we can awaken the dormant potential of the remaining strands. This means the 12-strand DNA is then, in an awakened state, a fully ordered system in which everything functions in harmony. So this is the developmental step that we are all invited to take right now. Not somewhere in the future, but this can already be achieved vibrationally right now. So DNA is also a storehouse of heredity, collective experience, and biological memory, but also the possibility to develop far beyond that and to really use the contents of the DNA as well. The double helix even shows itself as a spiral, which, as we've already seen, is always open, so it's ready for further development, for the leap in consciousness to the next higher level. And here 13 practically symbolizes the activation, the mutation, the leap. Because evolution is not repetition, but evolution means you go beyond what has existed until now. That's the only way something new is created. 13 symbolizes a process of mutation, epigenetic redirection, breaking old patterns, and discovering new possibilities. So we can ask ourselves, who are we when we have established the order of the 12 step 1 and then go beyond these 12? If we don't see the 12 as a fixed ultimate goal, but as an important stage that prepares the ground for what comes next, 12 preserves life and keeps it stable. 13 makes it conscious and develops it further. So 13 is the moment in which the system transcends itself. It's the moment when the old no longer carries enough and the new is perhaps not yet fully visible. But that is exactly what transformation is. Right here we have the greatest gift. 13 is a path of initiation, and I'd like to explain that to you as well. Initiation doesn't mean improvement, but rather transformation. 13 marks the moment of transformation. While 12 still asks, who am I within this system? 13 asks, who am I beyond it? And this archetypal path of 13 always follows 3 phases. The first phase is the decay of the old order. The old way no longer works. The old rules, roles, certainties, and identities lose their meaning. Then we enter this threshold state, also known as liminality. You're in between. No longer the old, but not yet the new. Many cultures had rituals for exactly this because they knew how important this state is. But today, as I said, it's pathologized and we often experience it as a life crisis, but also spiritual awakening. And the third phase is then rebirth. So after this passage through 1 and 2, which can be very profound, something new emerges. And this new thing, it's not conformed, but rather it is truthful. 13 brings no return to the old order, but a new level of consciousness. 12 teaches us practically how to live, and 13 teaches us to awaken. Initiation as an intervention in the code. The really good old mystery traditions knew that not every person lives the same version of their genetic potential. And they also work quite consciously with it, with the goal of awakening the individual's potential. In that sense, 13 practically meant initiation, so targeted confrontation, symbolic death. I've also made a podcast about the ego deaths that we're talking about here. A reordering of the identity of the true self beyond the ego, the personality. And that's practically the trigger that leads the DNA out of pure preservation mode. Often this initiation comes in the form of crises, losses, illnesses, or other shocks, so that we can recognize that what was okay or enough until now, what somehow sufficed, the 12, is no longer enough now that we're allowed to move on. And so even the codes in our DNA are then completely rewritten. They can be deleted, they can be rewritten, they can be expanded. Nothing is set in stone. We are not made of stone. Everything is energy. Life responds to consciousness, and neural and epigenetic patterns can completely reorganize themselves. Even our nervous system reorganizes itself, making a whole new coherence possible in all areas of life. And then we come to the divine human. The ancient Egyptians didn't believe that everyone automatically becomes immortal. Immortality was a state of consciousness that had to be prepared for. That's why they worked so intensively. A person who had gone through their initiations no longer lived only in this biological cycle, symbolized by the 12, but in the solar cycle, which was symbolized by the 13. Most people live within the 12. That means they repeatedly cycle through genetic imprints, family patterns, collective programs, karma, learned survival patterns, and so on, the repetition of established patterns. Regardless of whether they're destructive or not, they're repeated because we are in a circle. This is necessary in a way, but also limiting. We shouldn't remain within it. The 12 simply maintains itself, but that is not truly alive. The 13 is, in this case, once again the moment when we overcome all that and enter new territory. So we have access to everything that we are and can be. And we simply need to become more and more aware of that. Our genetic material can be read and evaluated in a completely new way, and thus be lived anew. We can tell ourselves over and over again, I do not have to live only what was inherited, but rather I can live what is possible, what I truly and freely choose. And I'd like to conclude this podcast with the explanation of why the 13 is the key to the new world we talk about so often, especially within this spiritual framework. And I think you've already noticed it. We live with the 12-month calendar in a generated, programmed world where we're shaped in 12 school grades. And the 13 isn't supposed to come up at all. We're meant to fear it. It shouldn't play a role because the 12 is already perfect. But that's exactly the fallacy we've been falling for so long, and it just doesn't work anymore. We live in this culture that leads perfectly through the 12, but then not into the 13, which would be natural, but into the fixation and preservation of the 12. We all tend to hold on to the 12 because we've been conditioned that way. 12 is good, it's round, it's clean, it's perfect. Everything's in there, we don't need anything else, right? But if we linger there, then we're no longer alive. And then we become dissatisfied and start shuffling our feet and begin to shake everything up somehow. We want to break through the glass ceiling we feel there, to leave the prison. No matter how fine and golden and orderly it may be. But then we get scared because we haven't learned to move into the 13 and allow this process. Up until now, it simply hasn't been permitted, hasn't been shown to us. It was never guided. All systems have worked towards keeping us in the 12. And the upheaval that 13 can mean, we weren't prepared for that. And we don't want it. It seems dangerous to us, doesn't it? We've become afraid of it. Whether through superstition or through the emptiness and disorientation that 13 initially triggers. In the past, such things were quite normal at certain times, in certain cycles of life, expected. And as I said, also guided, even ritualized. People were guided through it very wisely, knowing that they are important milestones in life. But today, we only know the fear of it. It's as if we're dying. And in a way, that's exactly what it is. Our ego dies bit by bit when we allow ourselves to repeatedly outgrow what we currently are or believe ourselves to be. When we repeatedly consider the impossible possible, choose vitality over security and truthfulness, and over applause. And at this point, I absolutely want to read a quote to you that has accompanied me for more than half my life and expresses exactly that. It's by Albert Schweitzer. I do not want to be a common man under any circumstances. I have a right to be uncommon if I can. I seek opportunity, not security. I do not wish to be a kept citizen, humbled and dulled by having the state look after me. I want to take the calculated risk, to dream and to build, to fail and to succeed. I refuse to barter incentive for a dole. I prefer the challenges of life to the guaranteed existence. I prefer the thrill of my own success. to the stale calm of utopia. I will not trade freedom for beneficence, nor my dignity for a handout. I have learned to think and act for myself, to look the world straight in the face and confess, this is my work. All of this is what I mean when I say I am a free person. Yes, so where do we go from here? I know that was a lot of information in this podcast, and believe me, I've only scratched the surface. There is so much more behind it. And I would also recommend that you listen to this podcast not just once, but twice, 3 times, 5 times, 10 times. The less your head tries to take in and process all the information, the more your heart can recognize the truth and importance of these processes. Do you feel the call within you? Do you want to follow it? Are you ready for your personal breakthrough, for your 13? Just the knowledge of the Christ oil, only one of the points in this podcast, but also every other point in this podcast, can be a game changer in your life if you have a sound knowledge of it and, above all, know how you can apply, activate, and integrate it into your life. Sometimes we still have a blockage that needs to be recognized and transformed in order to dive freely and adventurously into real life, into the 13. Sometimes it's also about certain activations, yes, the concrete uncovering of our potentials in order to experience the desired change. And for all that, there are my THEKI seminars, which go very deep. Please feel free to take a look at my homepage if this calls to you. I'm happy if it calls you, because then you've come to the right place and we can achieve a lot together. I hope that everyone who heard this today will enter into these processes, embrace these processes, set out into their personal 13, which can lead into a collective 13, which gives us the new world, that's been here for a long time, finally showing itself fully, finally making it truly tangible, collectively. I look forward to you, to all of us together. I'm glad you exist.